The entire restaurant went dead silent when Vincenzo Moretti walked in. He was a ghost, a myth built on blood. Nobody dared look at him, let alone serve him. That is, until a broke, exhausted waitress named Audrey tripped over a chair and swore violently in flawless, furious Neapolitan Italian. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a crowded room when true danger enters it. It isn't a dramatic, cinematic hush. It's a slow, suffocating drop in atmospheric pressure. Conversations don't just stop, they taper off into nervous murmurs, the clinking of heavy silver on porcelain suddenly sounding entirely too loud. It was a bleak, freezing Tuesday night in Chicago. Inside Il Cuore, a high-end, old-school Italian joint tucked into a gentrifying corner of the West Loop, the dinner rush was in full swing. Audrey Bennett, 24 years old and drowning in $40,000 of student debt, was balancing 3 trays of ossobuco while mentally calculating if she could afford both her heating bill and groceries that week. Then, the front doors opened, letting in a blast of bitter October wind, and Vincenzo Moretti. Audrey didn't know who he was at first. She just saw the immediate, visceral reaction of the staff and patrons. At table 4, a prominent city alderman suddenly found his risotto fascinating, refusing to look up. By the bar, 2 off-duty cops practically shrank into the mahogany woodwork. Vincenzo wasn't a caricature. He didn't wear a fedora, and there was no cigar clamped between his teeth. He was a man in his mid-30s, dressed in an understated, impeccably tailored, midnight blue suit that likely cost more than Audrey's car. His dark hair was neatly styled, his jawline sharp, but it was his eyes that gave him away, pale, icy, and entirely devoid of warmth. He moved with the terrifying, unhurried grace of an apex predator that knows it has no natural enemies in the wild. He was flanked by 2 men who wore their violence much more openly. They were large, broad-shouldered, and their eyes constantly scanned the room, cataloguing threats. Giovanni Russo, the normally boisterous owner of Il Cuore, turned the color of week-old mozzarella. He rushed forward, bowing his head slightly, a gesture of submission that made Audrey's stomach turn. "Mr. Moretti," Giovanni stammered, his thick accent thickening further with panic. "Table 9, your usual. It is ready." Vincenzo didn't say a word. He didn't even nod. He simply walked past Giovanni toward the secluded, crescent-shaped leather booth in the back corner of the restaurant. His men sat at the adjacent table, creating an invisible, impenetrable perimeter. The dead zone, as the staff called it. Back in the kitchen, the atmosphere was chaotic. "I'm not going out there," Paulie whispered frantically. Paulie was a 50-year-old veteran waiter who had worked at Il Cuore for a decade. Right now, he was hyperventilating against the stainless steel prep counter, sweat beading on his forehead. "Giovanni, I can't." His crew, they handle the loan sharks in Cicero. My brother-in-law owes them 50 grand. If Moretti recognizes me, if he puts 2 and 2 together, I'm a dead man. "Paulie, you are the senior captain," Giovanni hissed, grabbing him by the shoulders. "You have to serve him. If he thinks we are disrespecting him, he will burn this place to the ground." "I'll quit. I swear to God, Gio. I'll walk out that back door right now." Audrey watched the exchange, a heavy tray of empty dishes resting on her hip. She knew about Vincenzo Moretti, at least by reputation. Everyone in Chicago nightlife did. He was the alleged head of what remained of the Chicago outfit, a syndicate that had modernized its brutality for the 21st century. Real estate, shipping ports, illegal gambling rings, Moretti had his hands in everything. People who crossed him didn't end up sleeping with the Fishers. They ended up facing devastating IRS audits, losing their businesses, or quietly disappearing into the brutal winters of the Midwest. Never to be seen again. Giovanni looked around the kitchen, his eyes wild with desperation. The other waiters were suddenly very busy chopping parsley or staring intently at the floor tiles. "I'll do it," Audrey said. The kitchen went dead quiet. Giovanni stared at her. "Audrey, you are a good girl, but you do not understand who this man is. He does not tolerate mistakes. He does not tolerate anything. I understand that Paulie is about to have a heart attack, and you're going to lose your best customer if someone doesn't go out there," Audrey said, keeping her voice even. Inside, her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But she also knew something else. High-profile, dangerous men usually tipped in cash, and they tipped heavily to show off their wealth. Her rent was due in 3 days. and the eviction notice she'd received that morning was a far more immediate threat to her survival than an Italian mob boss. "Just tell me what he likes," Audrey said, smoothing down her black apron. Giovanni swallowed hard. "Sparkling water, San Pellegrino only, no ice. He will order the veal chop, rare. Do not ask him how his day was. Do not make small talk. Pour the water, take the order, and vanish." "Capaci?" "Got it," Audrey murmured. She grabbed a fresh silver tray, loaded it with a bottle of Pellegrino and a crystal glass, and pushed through the swinging doors into the dining room. The walk to table 9 felt like a march to the gallows. The entire restaurant seemed to track her progress. She felt the heavy, oppressive weight of the bodyguard's stares as she breached the perimeter of the dead zone. One of them, a man with a brutally flattened nose, shifted his weight, his hand resting casually near the inside of his jacket. Audrey kept her eyes fixed firmly on the table, forcing her breathing to remain steady. She stopped at Vincenzo's booth. Up close, the aura of danger radiating from him was palpable. It felt cold. He was reading an email on his phone, his thumb swiping sharply across the screen. He didn't look up as Audrey approached. "Good evening, sir," Audrey said, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. Vincenzo ignored her. He didn't so much as blink. He simply reached out and tapped the rim of the empty crystal glass with one long, elegant finger, a silent command. "Pour." Audrey bit the inside of her cheek to suppress a flare of irritation. She uncapped the Pellegrino, her hands perfectly steady, a small miracle, and poured the water, ensuring not a single drop splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth. As she poured, Vincenzo's phone buzzed. He answered it, bringing the device to his ear without breaking his gaze from the documents he had pulled from his breast pocket. "Pronto," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone. It wasn't the melodic, romanticized Italian from the movies. It was sharp, guttural, and laced with absolute authority. The person on the other end spoke rapidly. Audrey couldn't hear the caller, but she could read the sudden tension in Vincenzo's shoulders. His eyes darkened. "Ascoltami bene. Listen to me carefully," Vincenzo interrupted, his tone dropping an octave. He switched seamlessly from standard Italian into a thick, localized dialect. "Se chi lo stronz non porta e sorde entro di mane scassate gamme, tutte douge." Audrey froze. The bottle of Pellegrino hovered an inch above the glass. She understood him perfectly. If that asshole doesn't bring the money by tomorrow, break his legs. Both of them. It wasn't just that she understood the Italian, she understood the specific, gritty, Neapolitan street slang. Audrey had spent her entire childhood sitting at the kitchen table of her grandmother Rosa's house in the Bronx. Nonna Rosa had emigrated from the Quartieri Spagnoli, the Spanish quarters of Naples, a place notorious for its labyrinthine streets and hardened inhabitants. Rosa had spoken very little English, and she had raised Audrey on a steady diet of homemade pasta, terrifying Catholic guilt, and rapid-fire Neapolitan dialect. Vincenzo ended the call, tossing the phone onto the table with a sharp clack. He finally looked up at Audrey, his pale blue eyes locked onto hers, analyzing her stillness. He noticed the slight hesitation in her posture. "Is there a problem?" he asked in English. His accent was faint, practically non-existent, polished away by years of wealth and private schooling in the States. "No, sir," Audrey said quickly, pulling the bottle back. "Are you ready to order?" Vincenzo stared at her for a second longer. He seemed annoyed, rubbing his temple as if the phone call had given him a migraine. He didn't look at the menu. "Veal chop. Rare. And bring me a glass of the house red," he muttered dismissively, waving a hand to shoo her away. Then, under his breath, he murmured in Italian, clearly assuming the American waitress with the blonde hair and cheap shoes was entirely oblivious. "Questi fottuti americani. Servono vino che sa di aceto e si aspettano un premio. These fucking Americans. They serve wine that tastes like vinegar and expect a prize." It was a long day. Audrey's feet were bleeding, her back ached, and the looming threat of being homeless in a Chicago winter had worn her nerves down to the absolute nub. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of the man snapped the last thread of her self-preservation. Before her brain could catch up with her mouth, she replied, "Forse, se non ordinassi il vino della casa, come un turista a buon mercato, avresti qualcosa di decente da bere." Audrey shot back, her tone clipped, her Neapolitan accent flawlessly mimicking her late grandmother's sharp tongue. Maybe if you didn't order the house wine like a cheap tourist, you'd have something decent to drink. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The two bodyguards at the next table shot out of their chairs scraping violently against the hardwood floor. Hands vanished into jackets. In the distance, Giovanni dropped a plate. It shattered with a deafening crash, but nobody looked at him. Vincenzo Moretti went entirely, utterly still. He didn't yell. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just stared at Audrey, his icy eyes widening, just a fraction of a millimeter. The silence that stretched between them felt like a physical weight pressing against Audrey's chest. The reality of what she had just done crashed over her like freezing water. She had just insulted the head of the Chicago Mafia, in his own language, to his face. She braced herself, waiting for him to signal his men to drag her into the alley. Instead, Vincenzo slowly leaned back against the red leather booth. He tilted his head, his eyes raking over her face, stripping away the uniform and the apron, studying her as if she were a puzzle that had just inexplicably solved itself. "They don't say? Where are you from?" he asked softly. The dangerous edge was gone from his voice, replaced by a dark, intense curiosity. Audrey swallowed hard. "Mia nonna era di Napoli, quartieri spagnoli, my grandmother. She was from Naples, Spanish Quarters." Vincenzo's lips twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but the murderous intent had evaporated. Spanish Quarters, he mused in English. A tough neighborhood for a little girl. "Explain the accent." "She raised me," Audrey said, clutching her serving tray like a shield. She refused to speak English in the house, said it sounded like dogs barking. A low, deep chuckle rumbled from Vincenzo's chest. The sound was so unexpected that the bodyguards exchanged a bewildered look before slowly sitting back down, though their eyes never left Audrey. "Your grandmother was a smart woman," Vincenzo said. He picked up his water glass, took a slow sip, and set it down. The commanding, terrifying boss was still there, but the dynamic had shifted on its axis. He was no longer looking through her, he was looking at her. "I apologize, sir," Audrey said, her survival instincts finally kicking back in. "I shouldn't have spoken to you that way. I'll get your veal." "Wait," Vincenzo commanded softly. Audrey stopped. "If the house red is vinegar," Vincenzo said, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the table, "what does the foul-mouthed granddaughter of Naples suggest I drink with a rare veal chop?" Audrey blinked, taken aback. She mentally scanned the restaurant's high-end cellar knowledge she'd acquired, hoping to get promoted to sommelier one day. "The Amarone della Valpolicella," she said confidently. 2015 vintage. It's bold enough to stand up to the char on the veal, but the cherry notes will cut through the richness of the bone marrow. Vincenzo stared at her for a long moment. Then, he nodded once. "Bring it, and bring a second glass." Audrey's heart skipped a beat. "Sir, for you," Vincenzo said smoothly, picking up his phone again, signaling the conversation was over. "Unless you plan on insulting me again on an empty stomach." Audrey didn't drink with him. Giovanni would have fired her on the spot. But she brought the wine, and she served the veal. For the rest of the hour, Vincenzo ate in silence, reading his emails. Yet, every time Audrey walked past the dead zone to serve another table, she could feel the heat of his gaze tracking her movements. It was an intense, heavy scrutiny that made the fine hairs on the back of her neck stand up. When he finally left, he didn't say goodbye. He just stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out, his men falling in step behind him. The restaurant collectively exhaled, a massive sigh of relief echoing off the brick walls. Audrey approached table 9 to clear the plates. Underneath Vincenzo's empty crystal wine glass was a crisp, folded bill. She pulled it out. It was a $1,000 bill. Wrapped inside it was a small, torn corner of a napkin with a single Italian word written in elegant, sharp cursive ink. "Coraggiosa? Brave?" Audrey stared at the money, her hands shaking. It was enough to pay her rent and keep the heat on. It was a lifeline, but as she pocketed the cash, a deep, primal knot of dread formed in her stomach. You didn't take money from a man like Vincenzo Moretti without owing him something in return. She thought she had survived the encounter. She thought she would never see him again. She was wrong. 2 days later, on Thursday afternoon, Audrey walked out of her crumbling apartment building in Rogers Park, pulling her coat tight against the freezing wind. It was her day off, and she was heading to the grocery store. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, a massive, black, bulletproof Lincoln Navigator pulled up directly in front of her, blocking her path. The engine purred like a caged beast. Audrey froze. The back window smoothly glided down, revealing the scarred face of the bodyguard she had seen at the restaurant. "Miss Bennett," the bodyguard said, his voice like grinding gravel, "Mr. Moretti would like to have lunch with you." Audrey took a step back, her heart leaping into her throat. I have errands to run. Tell him thank you, but no." The bodyguard didn't smile. He just pushed the heavy SUV door open from the inside. "It wasn't a request, Audrey." Audrey stared at the gaping maw of the Lincoln Navigator, her breath pluming in the frigid Chicago air. She calculated her odds of running. She lived on the 3rd floor. She could bolt back up the fire escape. But the scarred bodyguard, a man built like a cinder block, was already leaning against the open door, his posture entirely relaxed, which somehow made him more terrifying. "I don't have a choice, do I?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough to betray her bravado. "Mr. Moretti prefers not to ask twice," the man replied smoothly. "My name is Silas. Please, get in. It is freezing, and the boss hates to be kept waiting." Swallowing the lump of absolute terror in her throat, Audrey climbed into the back of the SUV. The door thudded shut with the heavy, airtight finality of a bank vault. The interior smelled of expensive leather and faint cedar. She was entirely alone in the back, separated from Silas and the driver by a thick pane of soundproof glass. The drive took 20 minutes, heading south down Lakeshore Drive before weaving into the ultra-wealthy, iron-gated enclaves of the Gold Coast. The SUV glided to a halt in the underground parking garage of a sleek, glass-paneled high-rise. Silas escorted her to a private elevator, swiped a keycard, and pressed the button for the penthouse. When the doors parted, Audrey stepped into a space that looked less like an apartment and more like a modern art museum. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the Chicago skyline and the churning gray waters of Lake Michigan. Vincenzo Moretti stood by the glass, holding a tumbler of amber liquid. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket today. He wore a charcoal turtleneck and tailored trousers that emphasized the broad, athletic build beneath. "Miss Bennett," Vincenzo said, turning around. His voice was smooth, a stark contrast to the violence she knew he commanded. "Thank you for joining me." "I was essentially kidnapped on my way to buy laundry detergent, Mr. Moretti." Audrey fired back, her anxiety manifesting as reckless sarcasm. "I wouldn't exactly call it joining you." Vincenzo's lips curved into a faint, dangerous smile. He walked over to a wet bar and poured a second glass. "I appreciate directness. It saves time. Drink?" "I don't drink with mobsters," she said flatly. Vincenzo paused, the decanter hovering. He set it down, his pale blue eyes locking onto hers. "You are very brave, Audrey. Or very foolish. I haven't decided which. Sit down." It was a command, not an invitation. Audrey sat stiffly on the edge of a white leather sofa. "I had my people look into you after our interesting conversation at Il Quor." Vincenzo began, pacing slowly. "Audrey Bennett, 24, graduated from Northwestern with a degree in linguistics, but you're drowning in exactly $42,600 of student and medical debt from your late mother's illness. You are 3 months behind on rent, and your landlord is threatening eviction by Monday." Audrey's face flushed hot with humiliation and anger. "You have no right to look into my life." "I have every right when someone disrespects me in public," he countered softly, stopping right in front of her. "But I didn't bring you here to punish you. I brought you here because I need to hire you." Audrey blinked, utterly derailed. "Hire me? For what? Catering?" "For your tongue," Vincenzo said. Before Audrey could react to the heavy innuendo, he clarified. "This weekend, I am hosting a man named Don Domenico Ferri. He is an old-school boss from the Campania region in Italy specifically, the deepest, dirtiest parts of the Quartieri Spagnoli. He controls the shipping ports in Naples, ports I need access to for my import business. Domenico is paranoid, ancient, and he despises Americans. He refuses to speak English, and he speaks in a dialect so thick and coded with street slang that my standard translators miss half of what he is actually saying." Vincenzo leaned down, resting his hands on the coffee table, bringing his face mere inches from hers. The scent of him bergamot and cold rain was intoxicating. "I need someone who understands the subtext, someone who grew up breathing that specific dialect, someone who can sit at my side, smile politely, and tell me if Domenico is planning to shake my hand or put a bullet in my head." You want me to be a Mafia translator? Audrey whispered, her mind spinning. Are you insane? I'm a waitress. I don't know anything about the mob. I don't need you to know about the mob. I need you to know the language of the Spanish Quarters. I need your grandmother Rosa's ghost whispering in your ear, Vincenzo said, his gaze intense. In exchange, I will wipe your debt clean. All 42,000. Plus a $10,000 bonus for your time. 50 grand, tax-free, in a briefcase, by Sunday morning. And you never have to see me again. Audrey stared at him. $50,000. It was a life-altering sum of money. It was the difference between freezing on the streets and getting her life back. But the catch was terrifying. What if he finds out I'm not one of your people? She asked. He will think you are my woman, Vincenzo said smoothly, stating it as an undeniable fact. He respects tradition. A boss brings his woman to dinner. It shows stability. You will wear my ring, you will hold my arm, and you will translate everything he says into my ear. The silence in the penthouse was deafening. Audrey looked at his icy eyes, realizing the gravity of the situation. If she said no, she'd be evicted. If she said yes, she was stepping into the viper's nest. Fine, Audrey breathed, her hands shaking as she clenched them in her lap. But I want the cash up front. Held in an escrow account of my choosing. Vincenzo threw his head back and laughed a genuine, rich sound that echoed off the glass walls. Coraggiosa, he murmured again. You have a deal, little bird. Saturday night descended on Chicago with a bitter, howling snowstorm. Audrey stood in front of an ornate gilded mirror in the guest wing of Vincenzo's Lake Forest estate, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. A team of stylists had descended upon her that afternoon. Her hair was swept up into an elegant, complex chignon. She wore a floor-length, deep emerald silk gown that clung to her curves and left her back entirely bare. Around her neck rested a diamond collar that felt as heavy as a chain, and on her left ring finger sat a breathtaking 3-carat emerald-cut diamond. Armor, she told herself. It's just armor. A soft knock at the door broke her trance. Vincenzo walked in, dressed in a bespoke black tuxedo that made him look ruthlessly handsome. He stopped abruptly, his eyes sweeping over her from the hem of her gown to the diamonds at her throat. A flicker of something hot and unreadable passed through his pale eyes before he masked it with his usual cold composure. You look. Vincenzo paused, clearing his throat slightly. Adequate for the occasion. Don't flatter me too much. You'll make me blush, Audrey muttered dryly, grabbing a small clutch purse. Vincenzo stepped into her personal space, holding out his arm. Remember the rules. You speak only when spoken to. You smile. If he uses a phrase you don't understand, you squeeze my arm twice. If you think he is lying, you squeeze once. Understood? I'm risking my life for your shipping routes, Audrey said, looping her arm through his. The heat of his body radiated through the fine wool of his tuxedo. I understand perfectly. They descended the grand staircase to the estate's private dining room. The room was dripping in wealth, crystal chandeliers, mahogany-paneled walls, and a roaring fireplace. At the head of the table sat Don Domenico Ferri. He was a small, wizened man with skin like tanned leather and eyes like dead black coal. 2 massive Italian enforcers stood behind his chair. As Vincenzo and Audrey entered, Domenico's gaze snapped to her. It was an invasive, predatory look that made Audrey want to scrub her skin with bleach. E questa ci è? And who is this? Domenico rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves crushed underfoot. La mia fidanzata, Audrey. My fiancée, Audrey. Vincenzo replied effortlessly in standard Italian, pulling out a chair for her. La sua famiglia è dei quartieri spagnoli. Her family is from the Spanish Quarters. Domenico's thick white eyebrows shot up. A slow, yellowed smile spread across his face. Ah, una ragazza di casa. A hometown girl. Dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Course after course of delicate food was served, while Vincenzo and Domenico engaged in a high-stakes dance of negotiations. They spoke in rapid Italian, discussing percentages, customs officials, and shipping manifests. Audrey sat quietly, sipping her water, listening intently. At first, Domenico was playing fair, but as the wine flowed, the Don's dialect grew thicker, slipping into the obscure, gutter slang of the Neapolitan streets, exactly as Vincenzo had predicted. Va bene, Vincenzo, Domenico said, taking a sip of his espresso. Ti darò il 30% dei moli, ma voglio che le tue guardie si ritirino stasera. Facciamo un brindisi, come fratelli. Facciamo? A scarpetta nel piatto di sangue. Vincenzo's internal translator, an earpiece hidden in his ear, likely gave him the literal translation. I will give you 30% of the docks, but I want your guards to pull back tonight. Let's make a toast, like brothers. Let's wipe the plate clean in blood. Vincenzo smiled, raising his glass, ready to agree to the gesture of good faith. Audrey's blood ran cold. A scarpetta usually meant wiping a plate clean with bread. But in the deep, violent slang of the Camorra, the slang Nonna Rosa used when describing the men who had murdered her brother 50 years ago, fare a scarpetta nel piatto di sangue, didn't mean making a toast. It meant leaving no survivors to seek revenge. It was a signal for an ambush. He wasn't agreeing to the deal. He was telling his men to kill Vincenzo the second his guards stood down. Beneath the table, Audrey's hand shot out. She grabbed Vincenzo's thigh and squeezed once. Hard. He is lying. Vincenzo's smile didn't waver, but the muscles beneath Audrey's hand turned to absolute granite. He didn't blink. He lowered his glass just an inch. Zio Domenico Vincenzo said, his voice dripping with sudden, venomous respect, "Siamo in America. Qui non facciamo la scarpetta. Rompiamo il piatto." Uncle Domenico, we are in America. Here, we don't wipe the plate clean. We break the plate. Domenico's eyes widened in sudden, absolute shock. He realized instantly that Vincenzo understood the code. He looked directly at Audrey, putting the pieces together. The hometown girl wasn't just window dressing. She was the lockpick. Before Domenico's enforcers could reach for their weapons, Silas and 3 of Vincenzo's men materialized from the shadows of the dining room, their suppressed pistols drawn and aimed directly at the back of Domenico's head. The room went entirely silent, save for the crackling of the fireplace. "It seems our negotiations have concluded, Don Domenico," Vincenzo said softly, standing up from the table. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely victorious. "You will leave Chicago tonight. You will grant me unrestricted access to the docks in Naples for a flat fee of 10%, or you won't live to see the sunrise over Vesuvius. Do we have an understanding?" Domenico, trembling with suppressed rage and fear, slowly nodded. "Excellent," Vincenzo said. He turned to Audrey, offering his hand. "Come, darling. I believe we are finished here." Audrey placed her trembling hand in his. Her legs felt like jelly, but she kept her spine perfectly straight. As Vincenzo led her out of the dining room and into the quiet sanctuary of the hallway, the adrenaline finally crashed. She stumbled, her heel catching on the thick carpet. Vincenzo caught her effortlessly, his strong arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The facade of the cold mob boss cracked, revealing a man breathing heavily, his eyes blazing with a mixture of adrenaline and awe. "You saved my life," he whispered, his voice rough, staring down at her lips. "You owe me 50 grand. Audrey managed to gasp out, staring up at him. "I owe you far more than that," Vincenzo murmured, his gaze darkening as the space between them vanished. The hallway of the Lake Forest estate was suffocatingly quiet, the silence broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing. Vincenzo's grip on Audrey's waist was bruising, a desperate, anchoring hold. The man who had sat at a dining table 5 minutes ago and coldly orchestrated the downfall of a Camorra boss was entirely gone. In his place was someone raw, lethal, and undeniably captivated. "You owe me far more than that," Vincenzo murmured, his voice a gravelly whisper against her cheek. Before Audrey could form a sarcastic retort to protect herself, Vincenzo kissed her. It wasn't gentle, and it wasn't romantic in any traditional sense. It was a collision of adrenaline, relief, and an intoxicating, primal attraction that had been simmering since the moment she poured his water at Il Cuore. Audrey gasped against his mouth, her hands instinctively coming up to grip the lapels of his tuxedo. For a fleeting, terrifying second, she surrendered entirely, kissing him back with an intensity that mirrored his own. Then, the heavy sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment. Audrey pulled back, her chest heaving, her cheeks flushed scarlet. Vincenzo didn't let her go immediately. He rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes for a fraction of a second to regain his composure before turning to face the intrusion. It was Silas. The bodyguard's scarred face was carved out of granite, his posture rigid. "Boss, we have a complication," Silas said, his eyes respectfully avoiding Audrey's flushed face. Vincenzo's demeanor instantly shifted back to absolute freezing authority. He stepped slightly in front of Audrey, shielding her. "Speak." Domenico had a contingency plan in play before dinner even started, Silas reported, his voice low. He didn't entirely buy the fiancé cover story. He sent a secondary crew to verify her background. Silas paused, finally looking at Audrey with a grim expression. They hit the apartment in Rogers Park 30 minutes ago, Miss Bennett. They tore the place down to the studs looking for leverage. The bottom fell out of Audrey's stomach. The luxurious hallway seemed to spin wildly around her. My apartment? She stammered, the horror sinking in. My mother's photographs, my grandmother's journals, everything I own is in there. They didn't find anyone, so they torched it. Silas finished, brutally. The fire department is on the scene now. The building is a total loss. I'm sorry. Audrey swayed on her feet, the sheer weight of the loss crashing over her. The $50,000 Vincenzo had promised her felt meaningless now. She had survived the dinner, but her entire life outside of this mansion had been reduced to ash. She had nowhere to go. She was entirely untethered. Vincenzo's jaw ticked. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. Silas, Vincenzo said, his voice deadly quiet, completely devoid of emotion. Locate Domenico's crew. Do not make it quick. And ensure Domenico himself does not reach his private plane at Midway. He belongs to the lake now. Consider it done, Silas nodded, turning on his heel and disappearing back down the corridor. Vincenzo turned back to Audrey. She was trembling, wrapping her arms around her emerald silk gown, suddenly feeling very cold and very small. He didn't offer her empty platitudes or apologies. He knew the currency of his world was violence, and it had just spilled over into hers. He reached into his tuxedo jacket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen a few times before handing it to her. Audrey looked down through tear-blurred eyes. It was a confirmation screen for an offshore wire transfer. It wasn't for $50,000. It was for $5 million. Audrey stared at the zeros, her breath catching in her throat. What is this? Your debt is paid, Vincenzo said evenly. The rest is compensation for your apartment, your memories, and the absolute hell I dragged you into tonight. Silas has a private jet fueled and waiting at O'Hare. You will get on it. You can pick any city in the world, London, Geneva, Paris. I will have a new identity and a secure home waiting for you when you land. You will be completely untouchable, and you will never have to see my face again. Audrey looked up at him. He was giving her everything she had ever desperately wanted. Freedom, security, a clean slate. But as she studied his face, she saw the subtle, almost imperceptible tension in his jaw. She saw the profound, isolating loneliness in his pale blue eyes. He was pushing her away because it was the only way he knew how to keep her safe from the monster he had to be. She thought about the cold, empty apartment in Rogers Park. She thought about the grueling double shifts, the constant fear of eviction, the feeling of being entirely invisible to the world. And then she looked at the man standing in front of her, a man who commanded empires, yet had stopped a Mafia war because she squeezed his arm. Audrey slowly handed the phone back to him. I don't want to go to Geneva, she said softly, her voice steadying. Vincenzo's brows furrowed in genuine confusion. Audrey, you cannot stay here. Domenico was just the beginning. I have enemies in every corner of this city. My life is a target. If you stay anywhere near me, you will constantly be in the crosshairs. My grandmother survived the Spanish quarters during the Camorra Wars, Audrey said, lifting her chin, the fire returning to her eyes. She taught me how to read the streets, how to speak the language of wolves, and more importantly, she taught me never to run away from something that belongs to me. Vincenzo stepped closer, the space between them vanishing once again. You don't know what you are choosing, he warned, his voice a dark, rough rumble. If you stay, I will never let you leave. You will be mine. And I will burn Chicago to the ground before I let anyone touch a single hair on your head. Then hand me a match, Vincenzo, Audrey whispered, looking up into his icy eyes without a single ounce of fear. Vincenzo let out a ragged breath, wrapping his hands in her hair and pulling her in for a kiss that sealed her fate, binding the fearless waitress and the mob boss together in a world built on blood, loyalty, and an unbreakable mother tongue. She walked into Il Cuore as a desperate, drowning waitress and walked out as the only woman the head of the Chicago outfit would ever bow to. Audrey didn't just survive Vincenzo Moretti, she conquered him with a sharp tongue and an unbroken spirit. Sometimes the most dangerous man in the room isn't the one holding the gun, it's the woman who knows exactly how to tell him where to aim.